Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the Soft Landing Podcast, a gentle space for self-discovery. We're your hosts,
Rafaela
and Eric, and this week we're traveling through the rabbit hole as we discuss psychedelics and trauma. To help us out on the topic, we are joined by Renee Burwell. Renee is a nationally acclaimed psychotherapist and educator with specializations in sex therapy and trauma. Her practice, Pandora's Awakening, offers services and educational outreach that help destigmatize mental and sexual health services. She's a skilled facilitator in offering trainings and workshops to healthcare and social services professionals on mental health, sexual health, and reproductive justice. Renee has also trained with the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies and believes strongly in the power of plant medicine and other forms of psychedelic medicines in healing current and generational trauma. Renee holds a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology from Spelman College, a Master of Social Work and Master of Public Administration from the University of Southern California, a postgraduate certificate in Sex Therapy and Education from the University of Michigan, and is an ASECT certified sex therapist, supervisor, and educator. Welcome to the pod, Renee.
Thank you.
Thank
you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So to kind of get us ready for the conversation, I have Eric's inquiry for the week. And I just wanted to hear what surprised you about psychedelic assisted therapy when you first learned about it.
So it's interesting. I'm part of an organization called the American Academy of Psychotherapists. And in that organization, it is a lot of very prominent elders in the field of psychotherapy. It was actually founded by Carl Rogers, who created CBT therapy. And one day we were in the community talking about different modalities, and someone just stood up and said, I felt very shamed when I brought up psychedelics in this space. And I don't know why I felt shame. This was probably like 5 or 6 years ago. So this was before the big boom of psychedelics.
Right.
Then all of a sudden, this little one of the other elders in the space, she was probably somewhere in her 80s, late 80s. She stands up and she's like, no one should have shamed you when you stood up. She's like, back in the 60s, we used to take people on trips all the time. Almost everybody in this room has experimented and dabbled in helping treat people with psychedelics. But the problem is although it's so transformational, some people never came back after they took their trip. And that's why we don't dabble in that anymore. However, after that, I was like, wow, it was so transformational and everybody in the space has already done it. It just kind of had me curious because that's not something I've heard about before in the psychotherapy space. And for them to be very clear on the transformation, it really had me curious. And also, just to be frank, in my family, my grandmother, she's Bahamian, but is in Miami. Or, she's deceased now. She told me about a psychedelic experience she had, and it always made me curious. It wasn't a very pleasant trip, but it was very interesting hearing that story. So the two combined felt like a way for me to dabble more into the world of psychedelics, as well as even kind of reconnecting with some stories of my grandmother. So that's kind of what got me into this work. Or got me kind of started like looking into it. And then the Fantastic Fungi movie came out, which is a beautiful movie. If y'all have not seen it, I believe it's on Netflix. It goes into the whole pathways of the mushroom and fungi and how it pretty much transforms people, and possibly part of the reason why we speak today or have language is through the magic mushroom. So all of that had me kind of look more deeper into it and start studying it.
That's really interesting.
Yeah,
I'll have to check that out.
Same.
I love this connection with elders, right? So even the person in that space that wasn't your elder, but it was an elder who was able to talk about previous experiences, and then in your own family, being able to talk to your grandma and sharing that. And even though it wasn't the best, like that sparking your interest to dig deep and explore more.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure from what it sounds like now that I know more, I think she took some LSD, and she said their music came on, the lights were on, she was grooving and jamming and dancing. It was a blast. And then all of a sudden she got in a taxi cab and these kittens were in the back. I think this might have been a hallucination. And they just start crawling and clawing at her.
Oh no.
And then she said after that, she never touched it again.
That's scary.
Yeah.
Just to tell y'all that story is kind of funny and quick.
I mean, you can picture it.
Yeah.
But also if you were living it, it's like, oh no, that's like
Not
terrifying.
again. Yeah.
But just how she said she had a great time at first.
Yeah.
What is coming up for me when I'm thinking about what has been surprising around psychedelic assisted therapy, and I think for me it's just more so what I found interesting, because I recently participated in a conference that was all about psychedelics and therapy, and it was really just gaining more insight on what the whole process actually looks like. So I have a supervisee who reached out to me with questions on how to best support people if this ever became an option for folks, and I've learned about not only psychedelic assisted therapy, but also psychedelic integration and doing that type of work, but also what is needed to fully support folks who want to do this type of approach. And I think it was just eye-opening, because I've heard of other folks engaging in like ketamine assisted therapy, and their experience looked nothing like what I was learning it's supposed to look like. And surely there are different ways to do it, but it made me question, like, okay, how can we make sure people are well informed, so that way if they are engaging in ketamine therapy or any type of therapy, they know what to look for, they know what questions to ask, they can advocate for themselves or question things. And as therapists, we can also help them navigate that when we have more information.
The reality is, with all forms of healing modalities, a lot of us get into it uninformed and not knowing what we're doing. And there are different methods to all healing modalities again. And if you're not with the right person, anything can happen. So you definitely want to make sure you're with the right practitioners. You're using the right type of medicine. You know what your health care is looking like, your health, mental as well as physical. Because if you do have some traces of schizophrenia or a strong destabilizing mental health issue, these psychedelics might not be for you. Even breath work might not be for you. So there's multiple ways to access the unconscious. That's one thing I like to say about the plant medicine space, is like, all this stuff has been around forever, and all communities have had ways of accessing the altered states. Like, once I did breath work, it almost felt, and maybe because I've tried psychedelics before, but I was able to get right into that psychedelic space in breath work. And when I was doing the breath work, I can connect to catching the Holy Spirit, or what I saw of people catching the Holy Spirit in the Black community. I was able to connect with how we've all had multiple ways, and we look at people like, I understand why the Black people, why Black people are like, oh, I don't need mental health, I can go to church, because some of catching the Holy Spirit is very similar to some of the psychedelic experiences you might have if it's done properly and in the right community and setting. So everything's about set and setting when it comes to psychedelics, when it comes to all healing modalities. We're not meant to do this by ourselves. So that's just something to add based on what you just said about your supervisee. I said a lot. I hope that made sense.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, it made sense.
Tons of food for thought. Yeah, I think for me, as I was looking into the topic for today, the one thing that I definitely was like really intrigued by, and I really hope we do like get to that kind of piece of it, but some of the uses in looking at treating racial trauma, I thought was just like really interesting to think of it in like a really specific way, because a lot of it was talking about like PTSD mostly, but then I really came across some things looking at the uses of addressing racial trauma and how that has been helpful for people of color and Black communities and stuff like that. And there was one place, I forget the name of it, there's like one place I think in like Oakland, California, where there's a couple doing some really interesting things. They're not the ones who are providing the psychedelics, but people come to the space using it, and then they're taking them through these different experiences. And so just kind of learning more about that and thinking about it differently beyond just this, for me at least, seemingly white, space, and using this as like treatment. And so it was like a really cool thing for me to read about.
Let me think of where to start with that, because that's a deep thing. And I'll be honest, like, even as I go through my own journey with plant medicine and just going deeper, not just in plant medicines, but just in personal healing or spiritual growth or mental growth, all of the growth, you just kind of go into multiple different spaces. So one of the things that I look at real therapy doing, regardless if it's enhanced or enabled more with plant medicine or something else, is what you're doing is you have to bring down that defense mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of us, like, I think there's like 15 defense mechanisms. I could be wrong, maybe 13, 15. I always think, I know it's like an odd number, but some of them are, just for some of you who don't know, like humor is a defense mechanism. Regression is a defense mechanism. Intellectualization is a defense mechanism. There's some that are higher level, there's some that are lower level, but all these defense mechanisms are there to help us to cope with our days and not necessarily feel the deeper feeling underneath, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when you take like MDMA, or you take like a psychedelic, or even do certain kinds of other healing modalities like good EMDR or Gestalt, or even just basic therapy, can help decrease that defense mechanism. But when you take a psychedelic, most likely you don't have any control over that defense mechanism
Mm-hmm.
dropping and lowering. It's coming down. And if you're in the right supportive environment, when you're addressing that unconscious pain or that subconscious pain, it can do magnitudes of healing, and part of that is like, when you're doing therapy, it can take a long time to first trust your therapist, then start trusting yourself, then start trusting the process. But when you have certain medicines, it kind of is like you might not have a choice in whether you trust the people you're around,
Mm-hmm.
which can be positive and it can be very negative if
Mm-hmm.
you're in the wrong hands. But that's kind of what makes you, like, because I've been doing this work now, when I tried mushrooms for the first time, I took a hero's dose by accident. And I went on a very serious, deep journey. And I definitely felt like I did 10 years of therapy in that 6 hour span, because my defense mechanism was dropped completely. I was able to see things generationally, and kind of see how we're all connected. I was able to connect with the earth more, connect with the environment, connect with the universe, because it's not just us here, it's everything. We're atoms that are part of a bigger system. And it just kind of reminded you of all of that and helped you to kind of connect, like, regardless if you're black, white, whatever, we're all coming from, in some ways, the same energy. And if anything, I this is something I say, and I don't know who our audience is, but all of us in this space are African American, I'm assuming, or identify as that. And I feel like we're part of the origins of the source. We are the source, we're the originators. And people, as they become less melanated, are some ways losing their culture and their identity and their spirit. And kind of like part of the medicine and part of our culture in general, as people who are melanated, is to help bring those who may have lost their way back to community and back to the
Mm-hmm.
collective. And that's something that I've kind of been processing through and working on. And how, when you talk about generational traumas or racial trauma, when you take these medicines, you start seeing things from a different look. And it's not like us and them, it is us, it's we. But there are reasons why there is that divide based on, in some ways, we don't come to this earth to just have pleasure. There has to be some suffering to make our experience exciting.
Mm. Oh, talking about life's purpose. I think that's a whole other episode.
In some ways, that's what we do as therapists,
Mm-hmm.
right? Even though
That's a big question for a lot of folks.
Yeah.
What is my purpose?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
which really we're all in it. Like, we don't really have to overanalyze it, but if you want to lay on the bed and watch TV, that's your purpose at the time,
Yeah. Shame free,
But
Mm-hmm.
judgment free.
Yeah. Wow. So first, I do want to ask, what is a hero's dose? I'm curious of what that means.
so a hero's dose is a large amount of
Okay.
mushrooms. So it's usually anywhere from 3.5 grams or higher.
Okay.
Okay.
Got it. Okay.
And you said it was an accident that you
Yeah,
took that
because
much.
I started with 2 grams, and it was like, oh, I'm not feeling anything. So I'm like, I'm just gonna eat the rest of these, because it's like a little small. Grams are not that big,
Mhm.
Right. Yeah.
for the weight. So I was like, I'm just gonna eat the rest of these, and I ended up taking a total of 7. And it took me on a serious journey, but it didn't take me. I honestly will say I've done so much internal work and grounding in myself
Mm-hmm.
that I know that if I weren't as resourced, it could have been really problematic for me, or I may not have known how to calm myself down. But because I was highly resourced, as I was going through the experience, I was able to just lean into it and lean into whatever made me feel uncomfortable. Where some people may not be able to lean into the discomfort without additional support.
This is not a beginner's thing.
It's not a beginner's. You
Right.
know, some people will say start off with a microdose. I think it all depends on what work you've done. So
Mm-hmm.
some people, it could be something that they can do first off, you know, or starting off. It depends on what work you're trying to do. But I definitely believe most people, if you're going to do a hero's dose, you definitely need to be with, you probably need to have some strong guidance.
Yeah.
The
So
same
what I'm
thing.
hearing is the question isn't really how large of a dose do I start with? It is starting with grounding and being well resourced, building up that as a foundational component of using psychedelics, and especially when it comes to therapeutic use. Yeah.
And resources, some people don't know what that means, you know,
True.
but it is, like you just said, the grounding, it's possibly you having a therapist or some type of guide in support of you, having the certain types of music around, doing certain exercises before, having a good, like for ayahuasca, they have a whole diete, which is a diet. If you may need to do a certain kinds of cleanse to just prepare yourself mentally and physically for whatever your journey might be.
Mm-hmm.
So those are things that help to resource you. Getting more connected with nature are ways. Everything that is good for your mental health, exercise, all that good stuff is good to help resource you on your journey.
Well, since we are talking about grounding, we like to ground ourselves in our conversation. So we do want to just start off with a couple of questions. The first being, what exactly is psychedelic assisted therapy?
Okay, so psychedelic assisted therapy, it means that you've taken some type of a medicine.
Mm-hmm.
So, or some people call it medicine, some people call it plants, some people call it so many different things, sacrament. But for the purpose of psychedelic assisted, it would be something in the form of ketamine because that's legal in most states. You can do psilocybin, that's legal in some spaces, mostly in Oregon, and some people will go to the Caribbean islands to do psilocybin. Then there's MDMA, which is in the trials currently in multiple states, mostly done through the VA system. And, in the past, some people used to do LSD. Ayahuasca can be considered a psychedelic. There's all kinds of psychedelics, but those aren't necessarily the ones that you would get assisted therapy with
Mm.
unless you're in a certain. The three main ones you're going to see are psilocybin, MDMA, and ketamine. And what happens is based on your dosage, if you're doing a higher dose, because usually there's different ways people will start with ketamine. Some people will take a lozenge. Some people will start with you can get a shot of it. It's called intramuscular, but a shot is another way of saying it. And that can take you on what we would call kind of like a hero's journey or a dissociative space where you are no longer connected to your body. And then once you go through that process, that's more with ketamine. Then with psilocybin, you might take a high dosage, mostly through ingestion of food or of the actual mushroom or powder, drink it as a tea. And with MDMA, it's usually given in a capsule form, and with those you kind of you ingest them, and then you would have a blindfold on and some music, and then you would just kind of go through a little journey where your mind is in like a free association space where it's just like all these different thoughts coming to you, what people might also call downloads.
Mm.
And you are just seeing what people will do before they start is they will talk about different things they want to work on. So they might say, in my past, I had this happen. I might want to work on this. I might want to work on that. And then that's kind of like jarring up your brain to go into this journey space. and then you take the medicine and then you start going in a journey. And the reality is, you may have said, I want to work on my cat's death, and then all of a sudden you just hit a traumatic experience where you were in a car accident when you were the age of 5, and your parent had something happen and you didn't remember it, and all of a sudden, and some, it's not about repressed memories. So I just want to make that clear, because people think that, oh, I saw this in my experience and now this is probably what happened. It could just be that there's aspects of your unconscious that needs to process through whatever that pain or that feeling was. And then through, after that setting, the whole experience, which is usually 6 to 5 hours, you spend about 12 weeks talking to your therapist. And so sometimes people do the medicine journey with a therapist, and sometimes they don't, but ideally you would do it with your therapist, and you would kind of talk about like, what were some of the things that came up for you, how do you process that in this current space, how does it impact you, from how do you think that has influenced your whole life, and you would kind of just be able to talk through it. And then usually people will take another dosage, sometimes, within after 3 months or so, and then you would see what else comes up for you and how that might apply for your life, and then go through that whole integration space of like, how does this fit now, what are projections, and what are actually things that may be true, all those different things.
As we were talking, I was just really thinking about my own experiences with different substances, and nothing ever therapy related, but I don't really have good experiences. I don't have bad experience. Well, I don't have traumatic experiences.
Okay.
It just may be, feeling sick or things like that. But I've never had experiences that have felt enlightening, or that I was processing something, or that I was releasing something. It was just high, and I want to go to sleep, or I'm feeling sick, whatever the case is. So I'm amazed by the really beautiful, restorative, enlightening experiences that people can have when they engage in this process. And when people aren't doing it in a therapeutic way, but they're finding healing nonetheless. So I just think maybe it's my biology.
Could be. I mean, but I really go based on set and setting, and
intention.
everybody, yeah, and the intention too. So I consider the intention part of your set, because you're going in there with your set. The setting is like the space. The set is like what your intention is, and how you proceed, and what you desire in the medicine. So it's hard because, like, as I'm going through my journey, I'll take things recreationally too, just to see what it's like. But I'm so kind of spiritual before that it doesn't matter if I'm trying to just have fun. I'm going to always have some type of connection spiritually, because that's kind of where I'm at and how I perceive the world. And sometimes it's just not your time. It's not, or not your time, but it's not that person's time. So everything is just it. And certain medicines impact people differently too. Usually I've had people who will tell me the mushrooms are not working. It's not, and I've had times where the mushrooms just don't call to me. I call it calling. But then I'll have someone take some MDMA and it'll just take them right out, And then other people will take MDMA and they'll be able to have a party and do all kinds of different things. But again, it's about the set and setting where people go.
Yeah. Okay. I like that. I like that language of it didn't call to me, instead of me like, it didn't work. Nothing works.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
I usually, my first time trying psilocybin was on Easter over COVID, because I was like, we can't go anywhere. And, I hear all this stuff and I want to just experience what this is. So I asked another person to help me access that. And, that's when I went on this deep journey where I went into so many different places. So I usually do some type of connection to the medicine every Easter. But last year I did it on Easter and I had this really powerful experience. And then a few weeks later, I went to Jamaica to do a training with it. And I ended up, I would not go down whatsoever. I could feel it, but it was not calling, if that makes sense. Like, I did not go completely down. They kept giving me more and more. They're like, here goes 3 more grams. Here goes 3 more grams. And it wasn't doing anything. And
Yeah.
then part of it is with mushrooms, if you take it too close together, it just
Mm-hmm.
doesn't do it. But then also,
Mm-hmm.
I do believe, even though the set was kind of right, it wasn't right for me because
Mhm.
it just wasn't, I needed something different in
Mm-hmm.
order to have it move me in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's making me, I've had this conversation with folks before around the lack of calling, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always had this thought in the back of my mind that maybe that's my journey,
Mm-hmm.
to not have that experience, because I also just think about substance use, misuse, abuse in my family.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes I'm just like, maybe that's the universe is like, nah, you good. And I really don't have a calling towards it either. Like, I don't have a strong pull or desire
Yeah.
for that. And so, yeah, I was like, maybe it's just a protection thing. Like, why do you keep trying so hard, Rafaela? Like, leave it alone. It does not work for you.
Or again, it's just not calling for
Yeah,
you.
it's
You're
not
not
calling for me.
calling for it right now, you
Mm-mm.
know?
Yeah, I think for me, what's coming up is, and we were speaking of like substance use and abuse. I've been in the class for around that this semester, and when we were talking about some of what our own experiences of or learned ideas around substances, multiple of us were like, true, dare, like those, or truth and
Mm.
dare, like
Mm-hmm.
were such big things for us growing up. Like I remember in high school, I think it was either for truth or for dare. I don't remember which. There was like a speech contest that I entered about the bad use of. I think that it might have been true because I think it was about like flavored cigarettes, and I won like an iPod Nano from it, right? But like that was like the culture, right? Growing up, it was all these messages around drugs are bad. I was also raised in a really small rural space, and so Bible Belt in South in Florida, and very much so like these things are not good, these things are bad. Within my family, that was the messaging too. And so like I came from this understanding of drugs are bad,
Mm.
and then I think I had my own process of opening up a bit about it, but then I had a personal experience with someone in my life who started using mushrooms and taking them, and then had a mental episode that led to some other stuff. And in my head, I connected. It was like, oh, he did mushrooms, then that's why this all happened. Da, da, da. And so there was a while for me of, again, this kind of distrust in it. And
Mm-hmm.
so I also wonder like the amount of people, right, who have also maybe had that, who have had that hesitation of this idea of potential connection or calling that you're talking about, that this particular type of treatment can give. But because of even the elder in the room was saying, well, we did this back in the 60s and 70s, and this is what happened, this is why we don't do it anymore. And I think that there is like kind of this cultural idea around the use of psychedelics that is very much so like we don't touch that, except recently this reemergence, right?
Because we're afraid of accessing parts of us that make us no longer in control, quote
Mm,
unquote. But the
mm-hmm,
reality is control is an illusion in general, right? In some ways, I almost question if part of the reason why the psychedelics have been so excluded in the process is because of how much it gives people access to different parts of themselves and loving themselves that get them away from the consumeristic model.
mm,
But it's very complicated because even when I've told you about my grandmother's experience, that's on my mother's side. My dad, on the other hand, is a heroin addict. So I wasn't just told through Dare. I'm an 80s baby, early
mm-hmm,
80s. I'm a millennial elder. So the war on drugs was extremely
mm-hmm,
real for me, not just from hearing it, but also from in my household. So this whole psychedelic space was not something that I was interested in, at all until I heard it in that psychotherapy space and heard the transformation piece. And then at that same time, other pieces, again, I'm spiritual in general. So things just kept coming to me where it's just like, oh, this might be something for you to look into deeper. This might be something that can help with other people. And then when I actually tried it, I was like, this is like and I want to be very clear, there is no such thing as a miracle all in one drug. There's no such thing as a, in my opinion, let me just be clear, of once in a lifetime. I mean, things can be once in a lifetime transformational, quote unquote, but no matter what it is, it still takes you doing consistent work and meeting your life where it is, regardless of what that one experience is. There's so many people who've had health scares and cancer who don't quit smoking. You know, it's something deeper than that. So just saying that from the psychedelic space and from the war on drug space, and being a person of color who has been, most of us have been influenced strongly on the war on drugs. It's a complicated space to be in, to know that there is healing that's been denied to us, even in cannabis use, and stripped of us due to higher political gains and commercial gains. And it's still happening now. I mean, now look at what cannabis has become for people who don't look like us, and how much money they're making when there's so many people who are still incarcerated, and so many families have been split and destroyed based on that. You know, and sorry to even get into this, but
it's
I
valid.
feel heated, you know, because, you know, even like with the judgment that comes from, even when I say my father's a heroin addict, I didn't tell nobody that until recently. Like, that's something that was a source of major shame for me growing up. And I can even hear it in my voice as I'm saying that, shame. And it shouldn't have been, you know what I mean? My dad should have been able to have access to whatever he needed to help him connect or disconnect without that shame. And maybe he could have kicked it in a different way, or he could have got the support he needed in different ways, you know. And the same thing with most of our communities. It's like, the drugs aren't really always what's bad. It's the lack of support behind it, and the decriminalization, or not decriminalization, but the criminalization of it, that makes it so problematic in our spaces.
Have you read the book Drug Use for Grown-Ups, Chasing Liberty in the Land of Fear by Dr. Carl L. Hart from, I think, NYU? And it was like this whole big thing because he talks about his own heroin use recreationally and essentially how he's able to take care of things that he needs to take care of, you know, trying to minimize the stigma behind the use of those type of substances. Have you heard of that one?
I have heard of it. I have not read it. And it's a complicated space, right? Because again, I know somebody who was not able to function with it. And know many people, not just one, you know. And, you know, but at the end of the day, what I've come to my space and my heart, in my journey, is that everybody deserves sovereignty and autonomy to do whatever they choose to do with their bodies. It's so funny. I even have on my pro-choice shirt as we're having this conversation. But it's like, that's the core of it. It's like, if it's their body, they should have access to whatever they need to cope with their day and their journey. And if they're doing something criminal because of that mental instability, that's something else that needs to be repaired and worked on. But to judge someone based on their usage, you know, I mean, we have a lot of Puritan toxic beliefs in our communities, you know, when it comes to sex, when it comes to food, when it comes to anything that may seem gluttonous and overindulgent, especially when it is for people who are not of a certain income status. So I think those are things we have to work deeper on in general.
Yeah. And it's so conditional and biased, if you will, because, you know, people can feel and be kind of out of control, I guess, with whatever substance. But it's like certain substances are deemed worse and or is criminalized more than other ones, where it's just like, alcohol can ruins people's lives. And some people are able to drink in a way that it's fine. Some people can do some substances, you know, so it's just like, how does that come into a legal space where they are deciding which ones they want to criminalize? And I know there are a lot of politics and financial matters that kind of get pushed under the rug, as to, you know, capitalism and all this other stuff. But
yeah, I think that's a great point, because even in the conversation around psychedelics, right, like you were saying, psilocybin, got to go to the Caribbean to do it, right? but people are using it, right? Regardless of if it's in the context of, therapy and therapeutic process. And so, how do we be mindful of that? How do we have these larger conversations of when we do see this reemergence of psychedelics being used, that's thing eventually going to get wrapped into, profit, going to get wrapped into big pharma, gets wrapped into these bigger conversations around capitalism. But then we have other people who are using it outside of that context who are still being criminalized.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, these are difficult conversations. We can go on for hours.
Right.
And hours. But, as we're even talking about it, I mean, alcohol is the most dangerous drug, period. That statistically causes more sexual assaults, more road endangerments. All kinds of endangerments are happening because of alcohol, and it's still legal. We have naturopathic medicines, like in the state of Tennessee, where I'm from. You cannot practice naturopathic medicine because of politics of Vanderbilt and the Frist system. And so all of plant medicine kind of work is illegal because of the politics of how much it takes away from the medical system, the Western medical system.
Mm.
Yeah.
That may be changing, but that's what it has been for the past, since I've been doing this work, not the plant medicine work, but when I was trying to do more of a holistic wellness space, that you can't really have a naturopath in Tennessee.
Mm.
So those are, you see what I'm saying? Like, and even the voodoo stuff, like people will look at voodoo, and most of us in our culture look at it as very negative, but some of that stuff has major healing properties that we can't even talk about. We can't even address because it takes away from big farm. It takes away from, like I said, if you really do, it's funny when me and my roommate, when we finished, my roommate at the space, when we finished ayahuasca, the first thing we came out saying is, we're no longer doing all this shopping. We're getting rid of all of our stuff. We don't need it all. We're going to minimize, all this stuff. And it was funny, like we both said it at the same time. And she lives in New York. I live in Miami. Yeah. And we both still had that, like when you do like certain medicine or journeys, you start realizing how much all this stuff doesn't matter, and what really matters are the people in front of you, the present moment. And that's not stuff that you can capitalize off of. So it's almost like I wonder if some of these things are criminalized because they want to make money in other ways off of us. Yeah. So that's another random thought process with all of this.
Absolutely.
I definitely agree though.
Yeah. All right, so let's take a break and we'll get back to it and dig even further. And we're back. So, I know we just went into this really beautiful conversation, and I really enjoyed kind of the spaces we were going through with it. To kind of bring us back to the psychedelic assisted therapy piece, though, I would love for us to talk about what does that particular treatment look like for trauma-related diagnoses.
So it looks pretty much kind of like how I just explained it earlier. So, people would kind of talk about whatever their trauma is. And when I did my training, we will watch a lot of people who were veterans and who had gone through different traumatic experiences when they were overseas in Iraq or Afghanistan. And then typically what happened is they might start in that space for a few minutes, and then they would start doing journeys all the way back to their childhood, because most of the people who have PTSD, especially in adulthood, it usually doesn't just start from that one first trigger. And then you'll start going through your different triggers, or not triggers, but your traumatic events. And then from there, because of the 6-hour span, you can go in so many different places. And I don't know if you're like, the way I describe it is, it's kind of with EMDR, it's like first you're in the memory, or you're in the space of the trauma. And then as you do because your defense mechanism is lowered, you do more of the work and the more reflection, you start becoming, you no longer are in the memory, you're outside the memory, and you're able to see it from a different lens, and you're able to kind of insert different resources to help you move past that trauma. But because you have such like this intense experience with the medicine, most likely you're going to be going through several um, pinpoint spaces in your life. And not just your life, you'll even be able to connect your family of origins life stories. You may be able to connect to your, like, for me, when I did the psychedelic, I automatically assumed my assumption was I was going to be working on things around my dad and substances potentially. I didn't touch on him at all. He didn't come up in my journey. Still hasn't come up in any of the journeys I've done, honestly, which is very strange to me. Most of my journeys have always connected me back to my mother and my mother's family, which I don't, but that's where I go with, like, when people ask me, they're like, if I come to you to work on my sexual dysfunction, where will I go, or how will that healing look? And I just tell them, I'm like, you will go there, but how far you go there or where you go there, it really depends on what you're really battling with in the back of your brain at that time. That may not be the biggest hurdle you have to overcome right now. Your body, what I look at the medicine is doing, all of us are our own healers. All we do as therapists, as physicians, as clinicians, is we help facilitate your inner healer that's inside of you already. When you break your leg, your body has to heal itself, period. Like, they can reformat it to make sure it's healing in alignment to the best optimal way of healing. But at the end of the day, your body, your bones, your all those different neurons are reconnecting and restructuring itself for itself. The same, and I always use the physical because that's easier for people to visualize, but that's the same thing that's happening internally, is like, you're in a place with support, ideally, if you're doing it with a therapist involved, where you are able to retransform some of those misalignments in yourself emotionally, that are bad, that are going on in your unconscious or subconscious, you don't even recognize. And then when you're conscious, you can kind of apply it in a more sustainable way. But again, everything is based on you having a healthy community, having healthy therapists, having healthy practitioners. Just, I mean, there's a light and shadow to every space. So I just want to be very clear about that, because even when we talk about, oh, someone went here and they had this terrible experience, or they had a bad mushroom trip, just think about how many times, there's so many in Western medicine, people have had bad experiences with therapists, with, as a person of color in the reproductive health system. I'm sure many of us have had multiple bad experiences with healthcare providers. We have Black women dying all the time through childbirth, maternal healthcare. And yes, we're making a highlight of it now, but this stuff has been going on for years. But we don't dismiss the OBGYNs the same way we dismiss, the people who are doing naturopathic medicine. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind. Like, there's always going to be people who are not the best practitioners in these spaces. But there are really, really good practitioners, but you're going to hear about the dark side, because probably a little bit more, because it's not something that I think the people who are trying to make the money want people to know.
Right.
Yeah. I think that's a good reminder that there is light and shadows to everything that we do.
Absolutely.
From what you just mentioned, but also with medications that we take, right?
Yes.
There are side effects and negative symptoms that people can experience from their blood pressure medicine to their heart medicine. I have one of my great aunts. She has a medication for her heart, and one of the side effects is potential heart attack. So it's like, you damn if you do, damn if you don't.
Right.
And also the same thing with psychotropic medications, right? And so casting this negative light on psychedelics is inaccurate, right? And it definitely can seem like there's a motive there to dissuade people from considering it.
And even marijuana, I know people who would have never touched marijuana, 5 years ago.
But now that it's
Now,
legal,
Yeah.
you know, my
that's my grandma.
cat is getting CBD, my dog gets CBD oil,
Yeah.
you know.
That's so interesting though, right? Where it's
Yeah.
like, some folks are just rule followers, if you will. Like I know some folks who are very much of that belief or that practice of saying, when it's legal, I'll consider it.
Right.
There was no other thing besides the fact that it was illegal. And I think for those folks, that was really important for them for a variety of reasons: how they look, the experience of their family, especially when it comes to incarceration, and that was their choice to try to have as much protection control that they could. Like, if I can minimize one thing, it's going to be this, versus like, oh, it's legal, pass it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, absolutely.
It makes it complicated.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, personally, I remember definitely I identify as like growing up as like a goody two shoes, like I was the rule follower again, right? Like from home, from culture, from all these spaces of like, you need to do what you're supposed to do to stay safe, to do this, to do that, right? To succeed, to all these things. And even, I remember weed is legal here in Missouri. It's not in Florida. And I think I had accidentally brought with me a weed pen. My mom was like, oh my gosh, what are you doing?
What are you doing in Missouri?
Oh my gosh, you have to be safe. What is someone, all these things of these messages. And it literally is because of that piece around it is not legal here.
Yeah.
It wasn't even that I had it. It was like, I am worried about what that means and the repercussions,
Yeah,
right?
that's scary. Like
Yeah.
for for you driving
Yeah.
back home.
Yep.
And if something happens and they find this,
Yeah.
like, the fear is real.
It is.
For a lot
and
of
it
folks,
extends to all of this, for sure.
And I mean, and the reality is, it's hard. It's complicated because I used to be a big rule follower too, because that's what helped me feel safe and control in my very chaotic dynamic of my household in some ways. But the reality is, our existence and our placement in life and society today is illegal. As Black people, like we're supposed to be enslaved, in this country and be people's property, and that wasn't right.
Right.
So a lot of these laws aren't really. I mean, sorry, again, we're supposed to be talking about psychedelic assisted therapy, but it does go hand in hand.
It does.
It's like some of these laws are not created to protect people for real. They're created for profitization of certain spaces and for certain communities to make more money and have access to healing than others.
Yeah. And do not apologize. I think that this has to be part of the conversation.
And because those things do create cycles of trauma for folks.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's connected.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah. Social work, right? We got to look at all of it.
Yes, us social
You have to
workers.
look at the macro.
Yes. So I think, for me, what I'm also, really curious about and would love to talk about is how is the psychedelic assisted therapy different from just doing these traditional trauma focused therapies and the benefits that have been seen from it, as opposed to, again, right, like these traditional ways of doing the work.
I think the way I look at it is, one is going to get you into your unconscious in a very quicker way, and it's going to pull down your defense mechanisms a lot faster. I mean, that's really what it is it's pulling down your defense mechanisms, and it's making you address what's in the shadows quicker than what may be happening. You have to see your truth way quicker. You're going to see it way quicker in your psychedelic experience, especially if it's integrated properly, than you will CBT. Is going to take some time before you might just be getting skills. You might not necessarily be going deeper and understanding the root cause of why you're doing different things. EMDR, it's extremely powerful, and it's actually it's pretty controlled sometimes. But even with that being said, it's going to take a little bit longer because you're not getting something that's going to make you kind of do so much work without as much control. Because the reality is, sometimes what makes us not get our healing is because we're so protective of ourselves. We don't feel safe enough to go that far down without having something protect us properly. And some of us shouldn't be doing psychedelics because we don't, again, we're not grounded enough. We're not resourced enough to go in those dark spaces yet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I love the piece around like
Makes sense.
kind of, that reduction of those walls, because again, when I was doing the research for the episode, the one thing that I found was interesting was particularly the stuff I was reading about MDMA, was that it's specifically with EMDA, they were saying it allows for that fear kind of avoidance to drop away, right? And that it then allows you to not be afraid, to be able to go, like you're saying, to those dark spaces. And I found it really interesting because, like you're saying, right, if we're looking at some of the traditional therapies, it could take months to be able to get to the place where you feel like you're ready to do this. Whereas, with the psychedelics, it does seem to speed the process up, right? It allows us to be able to kind of skip a lot of the initial pieces of healing necessary to get to like actually the growth that we're looking for.
Yeah. I mean, it opens you up to be way more vulnerable in a faster way, and the reality is with traditional therapy, and I would say rightfully so, like people need to know that they're in a safe environment before they can do the deeper work. And they need to be skilled in a certain way to make sure that they feel supported in doing that work internally. And I think with the psychedelics, it just activates that inner healer inside of you a little bit. It brings that out so you have it in you to support you. Ideally, is kind of how I look at it. That inner healer is really coming out stronger. So as opposed to when you're in traditional therapy, the inner healer's at work, but you don't necessarily see it, But with psychedelics, you kind of have access to it, you see it, you're supported by it stronger. But I just want to name, again, psychedelics has its shadow sides too, with ketamine, there are clinics that are out here not really providing the therapy with it. It's just you're getting the psychedelic and you're leaving and you're not really processing through it. You have people who feel very vulnerable and exposed, and they're not being supported properly. So, even in the ayahuasca spaces and some of the other psychedelic spaces, you have people who do prey on certain types of people, when they're in these altered spaces. The same thing again with the churches, people prey on people in all these spaces. They're vulnerable. And these are the medicines can open you up to be very vulnerable. But if you're in the right space with the right professionals, you should be supported and you should be guided in a way that you feel completely safe. Not completely safe, because I don't believe in that, but
yes.
you get what I'm saying. You feel safe.
Absolutely. Well, let's take a break here and then we'll come back and finish out the episode. And we're back. So I would love for us to now talk about what is the course of action for someone who might want to pursue psychedelic treatment.
That is a very interesting conversation because there's multiple ways I can go down this, but I'm going to just be a little bit transparent about what I know.
Yeah.
So what is legal, like I mentioned earlier, is the ketamine. That is legal in most states, and I think all states. So you can always go to a ketamine clinic, but again, make sure you do your research on that clinic.
Right.
If you want to make sure you have a good psychedelic assisted therapist that's trained in doing this work. And you might want to ask, what does their process look like? Because if it's just you come in and you leave and we don't talk, well, there's no process afterwards, so you don't talk to a therapist afterwards, that might not be the place for you. But just, again, do your research. Then the MDMA is not legal right now. So you can do MDMA, I believe, like if you wanted to in like Amsterdam, St. Vincent, I believe it's legal.
Okay.
Um, and it's still in the trials. Most likely it probably will be legalized in the medical space next year.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of what the estimate is looking like. And then psilocybin is legal in Oregon for therapeutic spaces. It's decriminalized in a lot of other spaces, but actually used therapeutically is in Oregon. Now, on the other hand, there is a whole, and I didn't even know this until I did more of my training,
Mm-hmm.
because this is and I, again, I don't know the space, but because this is not a space open to many people of color, there's a whole
Mm-hmm.
underground network of
Mm.
psychedelic assisted therapists, and they call themselves the underground therapist. Which it's funny, we were on MAPS training. There were three therapists who were black, and none of us knew about the underground, right?
Right.
Mm.
And we're just like, how are you going to use our language? Or the Underground Railroad wasn't our.
Right.
I'm sure that wasn't just us. I'm sure white people are the primary pieces of the underground, but it is kind of demoralizing a little
Yeah.
bit that people of color don't have access to the spaces of the underground.
Mm-hmm.
But the underground is typically is pretty expensive. And in some ways it should be, because if people are putting their licenses on the line or
Yeah.
doing things that are criminalized, there is going to be a cost to that. And there's different physicians, there are some therapists that have access to all the multiple drugs, and they will do the psychedelic assisted therapy in a very healthy way or clinical way, but it is in an underground space, and you have to kind of ask around about who's doing that in your
Mm.
community.
Yeah.
I think cost is something to really talk
Absolutely.
about, regardless if it's underground or not,
Mm-hmm.
because it can be quite costly, and because of all of the other medical and legal implications, a lot of insurance may not going to cover it.
Mm-hmm.
And then also, yeah, like you said, with certain things, you have to be part of the clinical trial because it's
Right.
not yet legal. So if there's no place in your city, in your state, it's not going to be accessible to you. So I think there are a lot of barriers that people will face, even though it's this really exciting new thing that our culture and society is experiencing right now. It doesn't mean it's going to be accessible for everyone.
Right.
it, or it's not going to be accessible in the same ways for everybody. I mean,
Yeah.
there are a
Mm-hmm.
lot of people out here who are not clinically trained, who are giving people different journeys. And I'm not going to say that it's not healthy. It actually can be very healing and therapeutic to
Mm-hmm.
go on these journeys, even if it's not with a licensed professional. But ideally, even if you do a journey, what I would recommend is, if you were to do a journey with someone who's not licensed, you still should have some kind of licensed professional you're working with for your integration process and to talk through what your experience is. You want to be able to uncover some of that stuff in more of a trauma informed way by someone who is experienced and knowledgeable about how the brain actually works, or
Mm-hmm.
how emotions work
Mm-hmm.
in relationship to other people and yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful work, though, like the psychedelic integration trainings
Mm-hmm.
and support that therapists can play, especially if they may not be too keen to do the assisted piece
Right.
because of, their own feelings or whatever the case is. But having more folks who can be informed and aware so they can work with their clients, because sometimes you may have a client that comes into your session and tell you this and you're like, wait, hold on. I didn't
Uh-huh.
even know you were going to, do this. And they're wanting to talk about it. And you're like,
Being
yeah. So
equipped to
I think
handle it.
being able to advocate for more
Yeah.
training for therapists to do that work will be really helpful.
Well, one of the things that I was going to say really quickly is, one of the things that is so powerful about this unconscious is just like really sitting with, is this my stuff, or is this projections,
Mm-hmm.
or is
Mm-hmm.
it something from a past life? Is it spiritual? Is it, you like all these different things, and just having someone that can be there for you to help you process through that and help you find peace. It might not be solutions. That's the thing. I think our culture is very big on solution, and it sometimes solution isn't going to bring you
Yeah.
peace. But having people who are skilled at helping you to just kind of find peace in those, in whatever your discoveries are,
Mm.
um, that's what makes a psychedelic assisted therapist a really great asset to someone's journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the piece I was thinking about too was those who might be guides who aren't, these clinical professionals. I think that speaks to what you're saying earlier about the indigenous knowledge that can come about too from these practices and these medicines. Like when I'm thinking of peyote, right, which is really rooted in American traditions, protected as like this religious right that they have to it, and how that can be a really important space for someone who's looking for that journey to have someone who's connected to this practice on a really deep religious and cultural perspective that maybe even some clinicians won't have that insight to. And so I think that's really looking at honoring where these things are coming from in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're about to get into another hour conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, because that's like, I'm with that group I was telling you about, the American Academy of Psychotherapists. We're having a conference in October. I invite both of y'all to join. I will send y'all the scholars application. But with that being said, what the goal of it is to really talk about, where does all of our work stem from?
Mm-hmm.
Like when we talk about breath work, like if you've really done breath work, I did it with Stan Groff, who quote unquote created it. He uses nothing but African beats and drums and things like that. And it's like, this stuff has been in our cultures, multiple cultures, for generations upon generations, and not acknowledged whatsoever.
Mm-hmm. Maslow's
And like
hierarchy of needs.
Right. Exactly, Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah.
We know that stemmed from a Native American society.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of this stuff comes straight from Africa, in different ways, and we don't really give things its due justice unless it came from, a Freud or someone, that doesn't look like the origins of some of these spaces. So all I have to say is, like, we have to do more. We have to give more respect to the indigenous communities in the work that we do.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So, would love to ask you too, with all of what we're talking about, right? Where do you see psychedelic assisted therapy going from here? I know you mentioned like the NDA piece, which actually, like you mentioned, like being trained with MAPS. That they came up a lot in the research I was doing, and there was even, I think the most recent study was with I just looked it up, Van der Kolk, the guy who wrote Bite Keeps a Score, and they were looking at like the research with the NDA and the benefits that it was having for clients in the trials. And so I'm really curious, like, for your own kind of thinking around this, where do you see a lot of this going from here?
I think it's complicated because there is a major discussion around social justice when it comes to this work, so there are several people who are underground therapists who say they will remain underground because of the politics. Like in Oregon, for a therapist to get fully trained and properly doing this work, it costs almost $50,000.
Wow.
To get fully licensed. That's not accessible to a lot of us, as therapists. And then if I'm paying $50,000 to get trained, what am I going to charge, right? Like, I'm not going to be taking insurance and getting paid 60 or maybe 100 when I have a $50,000 loan to do this work. Like, it's going to get expensive. It's still going to be an accessibility issue, just based on the legalities of it. Who's going to be able to actually give the medicine? I mean, MDMA is not a hard substance. It actually, if it's done properly, it's less dangerous than getting your tooth pulled. So, or it actually, I think, is less dangerous than sugar. If we really,
I was going to say that when you were talking about drugs and alcohol, I was like, oh, sugar.
Ooh,
come on
that's
now.
again a whole other.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, but the reality is, people are going to want physicians on board, and physicians cost more money. Right now, the protocol is that you don't have to be a physician to hand out the medication for when they are supposed to open it up. But I don't know if that's actually going to be the case once the FDA actually approves it. Indeed, approves these type of medicines. So I that's why I say I don't know where it will go.
Yeah.
Because in some ways I question what my access will be. As a person who's doing this work or learning this work. Fortunately, I'm in Miami, so I can hop to an island very easily. I can go to the Caribbean and have access to do this type of work, but that's still expensive for people. That I'm privileged in that way. So we will see. But right now, what's probably going to happen is people are going to be doing grow kits on their own, taking these medicines, probably. People are going to have some hazardous stuff because they're not taking this whole work responsibly, and they might have some kind of fungi on their mushroom, and then we're going to hear about all these stories that aren't really the greatest because people aren't getting access to these medicines in the way, or the plants in the ways that are the most optimal.
Wow. Well, I really appreciate just the generous amount of knowledge. I think at the beginning you're saying downloading. I feel like I downloaded so much in this conversation, and I'm really, really appreciative of it. So, Renee, what are some final thoughts or advice that you might have for our listeners?
And I didn't say this, but really all of these plant medicines or medicines, what they really are doing are they're activating meditation on a deeper level. So you don't need a medicine to get you to your higher self, into your inner healer. If you do active exercise and have an active meditation practice, you can do a lot of internal healing, regardless if you have access to some high quality medicine or not, or even therapy. And I'm very big on therapy, but I just want to tell people, like, not everybody has access, but we can all access if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And with you doing that work, opportunities of access can come if that's what's meant for you to have in your life, is what I strongly believe in. And ideally, if you have the flexibility and open-mindedness, I hope all of us will at some point get a chance to have access to trying out plant medicine, or not just plant medicine, because MDMA is not plant medicine, but some type of psychedelic where you can get in touch with a part of you that you may not naturally be able to get in touch with.
I love that. Like you were saying, just like with the psychedelics, the work that we're all trying to do is to aid people, right? And so really appreciate that final thought and the realization that we can all get there by ourselves, but these are just aids that we can rely on to help us get there. Wow. All right. Well, I am really, again, grateful for the conversation that we had. And again, we could keep talking for many hours to go. But this has really been quite the ride with you, Renee. So we really thank you immensely for joining us today and the wisdom that you dropped on us. And so is there anything you would like to promote, or where can our listeners find you?
Oh, well, thank you.
Of course.
My Instagram is at Holistic Sex Therapist. And if you want to ever get in touch with me on my websites, it's reneeburwell.com. And I'm sure they'll put my name up there so you can spell it correctly. Or you can go to pandorasawakening.com. I don't necessarily talk about the psychedelic assisted therapy on my websites at this time, but that is, if you have questions or you need resources or you want to know of people who are providing different kinds of journeys, I will definitely have that promoted. And also I do retreats that I will be putting on my websites too, that people can have access to, and try to make sure these medicines are accessible to people as much as possible.
Right. Awesome. Well, listeners, that is it for this week. So come back next time as we discuss trauma and attachment. You can also follow us at Soft Landing Podcast on Instagram and at healingexchange.com/podcast. Please rate and subscribe to us on Spotify and send us your questions. All right, we'll see y'all next time. Bye.